So welcome to everyone. I'm just going to get started. My name is Leah, and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada. And I'm very excited for today's webinar, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our presenter in just a minute. First, I'm just going to tell you about a few resources that Women's Shelters Canada has available for you and for your shelters. Women's Shelters Canada provides a strong, unified, pan-Canadian voice on the issue of violence against women. And so we were created in 2012 by the provincial and territorial shelter associations. And so we focus on connecting shelters, connecting shelter associations across provincial and territorial boundaries to exchange knowledge, to strengthen their work, and to make sure that their voices are sort of heard in policies and legislation that affect them. And so we've put together a few resources in the past few weeks just to kind of speak to or help out with the current COVID-19 situation. And so I'm going to share the links for these in the chat box in just a minute when I'm done speaking, but just to tell you what's there, we have a Facebook group, a closed private Facebook group for shelter workers to connect and share resources and ideas with each other. We also have been compiling practices into a Google Doc that shelters can use to kind of look through if you're looking for an example of something or ideas. And a resource page on our website. So like I said, I will be sharing those links very shortly. And I've seen someone asking whether you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint afterwards. I certainly can share these links and resources with you afterwards. So just before I jump into handing it off to Kathryn, just a quick reminder, pour celles qui veulent écouter en français, vous pouvez utiliser nos lignes de conférence et les instructions pour ça sont dans la messagerie en dessous de votre écran. And for those who are using the telephone line, if you can just make sure to use *6 to mute your line, please. So without further ado, today we are hearing about implications for fundraising for VAW shelters during these COVID-19 times. And we're hearing about that from Kathryn Babcock, excuse me, who is the founder and CEO of capitalW. And so she is a leading revenue strategist for the advancement of women and the co-founder as well of global fintech Women Round the World, and the former Vice President of Development at the Canadian Women's Foundation, and the founding CEO of the Dress for Success Canada Foundation. So she's pulling on lots of experience to speak with us here today. And so we're quite excited to hear from her. Just a quick note before Kathryn starts. On your screen here, I'm just showing you down at the bottom, there's a chat box and a Q&A box. And so throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and Kathryn will respond to those throughout and as much as possible. So hopefully there'll be lots of questions, lots of participation. And so without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, Kathryn, and you can share your PowerPoint, and I will pass it over to you.
Great. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, lovely. I want to thank you all for the work that you're doing in a pandemic that we have not seen in our lifetimes. You're on the front lines. You're the emergency responders of the pandemic, within the pandemic, that of violence against women. It's interesting when COVID-19 parameters came out in terms of staying at home, it presumed a couple of things. One was that people had a home, and the second is that people are safe at home. And these are assumptions that we've all been very aware of not being true. And it has certainly come to light through the presumptions of this COVID-19. So as was mentioned, my name is Kathryn Babcock, and I've started a consulting practice that just focuses on mobilizing resources for women. My observation over my career is that many of the women's organizations who are enabling women to survive themselves are often struggling for survival from a fundraising perspective. And the small contribution that I can make is to work on creating funding engines for the frontline work. And a few pieces related to domestic violence that I've been involved with was the creation of the Shelter from the Storm campaign at the Canadian Women's Foundation, which raised $20 million over its lifespan. And recently, the Strengthening Ties Initiative for Women's Shelters Canada, which engaged 100 men in pledging operational funding for a 3-year period. And I'm interested in looking at things differently and in new ways to support the work that matters most. In this presentation, I will do 3 things. One is I'm going to provide an overview of the COVID-19 fundraising landscape. Some of it's general to the charitable sector and some of it's specific to shelters. The second is I'll provide short-term fundraising responses. I have taken the liberty of developing a virtual event concept that you are free to implement as an example of a short-term response. And the third is to provide long-term fundraising pandemic resilience reflections. Because whatever the new normal is, it's going to be seen through the lens of what we're all experiencing together. It is. Now to figure out how to move. The situation is truly unprecedented. We literally have never been here before, none of us anywhere. And we are navigating an unfolding situation. We're literally building a bridge as we cross it. And some of us are experiencing, we're building a bridge mid-air because it's not under our feet quite yet. And on the other side of this, philanthropy and giving will not be the same. We don't know what all of the changes will be, but we can make some educated guesses. Every donor, large and small in Canada, whether they be corporate or personal, for the first time in their lifetimes, have seen what it looks like to have the bottom fall out overnight. And that is going to change how people give. And it's going to change differently according to different demographics, but there are some specific implications that I'll walk through. But the other is that we're all in this together, and it's the first time that there's a sense of not only global but local community, in the sense that the same thing is on everyone's mind, and there is remarkable examples of people coming together. And as a fundraiser, I'm a born and bred optimist, and I'm already looking for kind of new growth and opportunities to build on, similar to when a forest is burning down, the new growth that's going to emerge, and I trust that it's there. And the final note I want to make just at the beginning is that shelters are specialists in rebuilding when the bottom falls out. And you do that every day for the women that you serve. And I believe your experience and expertise in that is going to be so important as we bridge to a pandemic new normal and what it looks like to rebuild when everything's been taken away. Okay, so COVID-19 landscape. So the first and foremost and the biggest implication for fundraising is social distancing, and specifically the cancellation of fundraising events. And even in the COVID-19, and when social distancing is relieved, I think that there's going to be a reticence to be in public context, at least until there's a vaccination for COVID. And I think it will inform how people are comfortable in events, period, for our lifetimes. And so there's an implication for that for many shelters and many organizations who rely on events for fundraising. The other implication is the economic downturn. So we can look at what happened in 2008 when there was the bottom fell out of the markets. It didn't fall out of the world, but it fell out of the markets. And there was a a substantive decline in charitable giving related to that. And we don't know what that's going to look like, but again, we can make some guesses. The first thing that we know is that endowments have lost up to 30% of their value. So private foundations that are giving out of endowments are now able to give 30% less than what they were doing before. The second piece is that a lot of people who are retired by virtue of their RRSPs having declined are going to need to either get back into the workforce or really constrict their spending in order to accommodate what they had thought was a predictable rate of return. And while we don't know what donors are going to be doing, and the analysis that's come out so far is mostly from the United States, and it's showing that a lot of donors are staying the course, and it's segmented by Gen X versus millennials versus boomers. But this is, again, unprecedented, because the difference between what happened in 2008 is that it was an economic crisis because of economic factors. What we've never encountered before is that this is an economic crisis by virtue of the economy being put into a medically induced coma. And we have never seen this before. And so how that will affect donors, we're not sure. So I did want to share with you one study that, because what we do know is that consumer confidence and donor confidence have a similar trajectory. And so I just wanted to share the next slide, that a report, a survey that was done about where Canadians are in terms of, from a consumer's perspective, and it stayed pretty constant between 20% being optimistic, 20% pessimistic, and the middle chunk being unsure. And uncertainty often errs towards conservation of resources. So that's just one lens to look at, and there'll be lots of others as this is an unfolding situation. So back to this. So there's the economic downturn, but there's also then the emergency response focus, which situates women's shelters very well. I work with some women's organizations that need to pivot entirely because they're not in the emergency response space. And so, for example, they're migrating to accompanying women in terms of filling out all of their applications for subsidies and resources. But shelters have been firmly on the front lines of emergency response, and that has been reflected in terms of the government priorities. And I would say shelters and sexual assault centers are among the triad of government and society priority, alongside of food banks and mental health response. And so, although there is the downturn and there are other factors, women's shelters are positioned well to be able to capitalize on the emergency response funding that's coming. And the final piece is going to be what's happening is that there's a resilience imperative. It became quickly apparent how vulnerable the charitable sector is in terms of not having been dissuaded from having substantive operating reserves, the reliance on certain kinds of fundraising that have now been suspended. And Imagine Canada has done lots of work in terms of what the expectation is in terms of job loss and other pieces. And whatever going forward, the resilience of an organization from a funding perspective is going to be really important and rethought. So those are the things that are happening and emerging in the conversations right now about in the charitable space. So in the short term, the recommendation that I would offer is that to build the response with your existing partners, whether they be corporate or foundation or where you're getting your resourcing from, to help to have them walk through this journey, and particularly to to position it that you have been with us before COVID and you're our partners in this emergency response, because people are looking for a sense of meaning and a sense of being able to do something to help, and this is allowing them to be part of your journey. And depending on who your partners are and what the relationship is like, they are your best bet for getting increased donations and stepping up in other ways. And so it's really really a way to kind of stay close and to position it that they are partners with you in terms of working towards this. And if they're not able to, it's an opportunity to honor them for having been there, such that you are able to do what you're doing during COVID. So either way, stay close to your donors. The second is to move to a virtual event. And I asked Leah to kind of post a poll around how many of you have had to cancel events that are substantial fundraisers for you, just to get a sense.
Yeah, so that poll is up right now. So I'd encourage people to quickly respond to that, and then we'll be able to share the results.
Okay, great.
I'll maybe
So while
give...
people, so while people are responding, I'll continue. Is that
sure?
Okay. So as I mentioned before, I
was just going to say, it looks like most people have answered. Do you want me to share the results now, or okay? So share results. So hopefully that's up on everyone's screen at the moment. It looks like 77% of people have had to cancel and 23% haven't.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the majority. So so the issues around kind of wrapping one's head around virtual events is, as I mentioned before, even kind of post-COVID, you know, when the vaccine comes, you know, 2 years from now, et cetera, it's going to be very different, and what those events will look like and what the comfort level is, we do not know, but there's an imperative to move to virtual events for the COVID-19 response and beyond. And I've developed out a concept that you're free to use if you're able to, that I'll share with you in a moment. The other piece of donor stewardship is just picking up on what I was referring to in terms of the donor partners. So this is a really important time for any donors to give you 5 cents or volunteer with you or give you $500,000, that that you reach out to them and let them be part of the journey that you're experiencing, because they are familiar with the issue by virtue of supporting you, but also there's been an extraordinary amount of press and magazine articles and thought pieces from all over the world on the pandemic within the pandemic, domestic violence within the larger pandemic. And so it's an opportunity to share articles, to share reflections, to make them feel that they are part of what's happening and on the other side. And the fourth is to look at emergency grants. One of the resources that I posted is, which is on the slide at the end, is Imagine Canada. They have a Grant Connect database, which is typically one that you need to pay for, but they have a free community edition that they're offering through COVID. And they have excellent summaries about where the emergency funding is. And shelters, again, are very well situated for being able to apply for those resources, whether it be from community foundations or particular companies or other folks. The other piece too is that, given that shelters are overwhelmed with work, to think about using volunteers in a different way, in terms of anyone who has writing experience, anybody who's who might be at home and have some time to be able to pitch in and work through some of these pieces. And then the final one is to support sector initiatives, and by that I mean the broader charitable sector initiatives, to add your individual shelter voices to initiatives that are being put forward to have support for the sector as a whole. Imagine Canada is one of those, and there are others, but I've posted what they're working on right now in terms of a multi-billion-dollar ask to government around a sector resilience fund. So there's ways of getting behind that. And again, by virtue of you being shelters, it matters a lot to have your voice there because you're one of the most seen as the most critical services. So I'm just going to stop there for a moment before I get to the virtual event concept. Are there any questions?
There aren't any yet, so if people do want to write their questions in, I'd encourage you to do that. Oh, here's one. Where are the support sector initiatives posted? Or so if there are sector initiatives, how do people find out about them, I guess?
Yeah, there's a link at the bottom at the end of the presentation to Imagine Canada's sector initiative, and there's also a page that has every resource a fundraiser would ever want and more on the COVID-19 that has been centralized by Imagine Canada, which includes some of those initiatives. Okay. Okay. So in terms of the virtual event, there are a couple of things that we considered in terms of developing this. One was presuming that majority of shelters had an event already in place, and that you have all of the things that go with that in terms of having a volunteer committee, in terms of doing all the things that come with doing a special event, that there could be an opportunity to capitalize on COVID-19 and to do something, and I would see the optimum timeline for this within the next month, if possible, if there was already an event planned, or 6 weeks. But the concept is what we call shelter in place. And I just put in part of Interval House as a placeholder, as the name of a shelter. And so what it is, it's a play on a COVID-19 moment when everyone's being asked to shelter in place. And women's shelters are the only ones that can take that as a bona fide play on words. And the idea is to have dinner delivered from local restaurants. So again, it's connecting the shelter with local, like restaurants and small businesses that are struggling also. Have local talent perform, and then have online meal sharing. So imagine like whatever, if it's a gala, people are in their dresses, and there's a kind of a playful dimension to it, and eating the dinners that have been served for a shelter in place. And what I think is strong about this concept is that the shelters are local, and there's going to be a lot of local businesses and small businesses obviously are struggling. The restaurant industry has been almost decimated. The performing arts community has almost been decimated, and this is an opportunity for you as a shelter in terms of the fundraiser to work with local restaurants to do delivery, work with local musical artists, and have it have a community feel to it, and virtual silent auction. So the idea would be to sell tickets and to do so online, and have a Zoom or whatever other mechanism for this to happen. And what I'm observing is that there's a lot of interest in events that shelters are doing in terms of pivoting. So in Toronto, the Red Door Shelter did something called the Community Dance Off, where they had different streets dancing, I guess getting pledges for dances 6 feet apart, and it generated television media. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to amplify the efforts of the volunteer committees to reach out to local media to cover it. And so this is the thought. Any questions about this?
None that have come in so far. I will keep an eye on it as people, maybe they're writing.
And if you have any, if you're interested in doing this afterwards, feel free to email me and I can help you talk through some of the pieces. Again, this would be something that would be marvelous as a national initiative that members of Women's Shelters Canada would participate in, but it's we don't have there's no time to do something at that level because this is very much a time sensitive piece, but it's also something that could have longevity. So anyway, that's an idea, and there are others, and I put the link to what the Red Door did in Toronto, and I'm sure that you all are doing very interesting things also, and it might be great to share those in the Facebook space.
So there is a question that's come in while you were saying that, and it's about, so other than the silent auction component, so how would something like this generate funds specifically?
So you sell tickets, $250 or whatever makes sense in your market. So just imagine that you have a gala, so $250, and you spend $50 on their meal and whatever else you're going to provide at their homes. You pay the talent that's going to do a performance for them, and then you keep the rest. So it's similar to doing a regular event. So if you sell 100 tickets at $250 cost, and it costs $100 for all of the putting all the pieces together, then my math is right. That would be $30,000 raised.
Great. Thank you from that person and someone else who's said that it sounds amazing, especially with local restaurants involved.
Mm-hmm. And it really reinforces that we are all in this together, and that we need to help each other to get through it. And I think that it has lots of possibilities for sure. So, okay, so I'll leave that in the interest of time, but again, be in touch. So in terms of pandemic resilience, so as I said, this is something that is, we are never not going to have gone through this. And even if everything goes back to tickety-boo, we will always know that this could happen any day in a way that we did not know before. And that is going to inform fundraising going forward. One is that operating reserves, which I talked about. A lot of funders have been, and donors, and have been reticent to see charities have too much in their reserves because it's seen as not mobilizing the resources for charitable cause. That is going to change. And so to think about in terms of like, legacy giving, even working with partners that they see some of their gift going into a reserve as being the smartest philanthropic thing that they could do in terms of enabling the shelters to navigate the next pandemic. And it's going to be like an accordion for the next couple of years. It's like the social distancing might ebb, and then there's a hot spot and it comes back. And so there's going to be a lot of fluidity ahead, and operational reserves are going to be really important and to be put into the case for support in terms of the work you're doing with donors. The second is to migrate to online fundraising. There are a lot of, I'm curious, and asked Leah to do a poll about how many of you are doing online already. And it might be worth another conversation in terms of what all of the platforms there are, but it is not, there's lots of mechanisms for online fundraising, and it's going to be incumbent upon the shelters and any charitable organization of the future to become really adept at those platforms. And there's lots of fundraising platforms that can be used, and both in terms of data collection and constituent management, but also kind of virtual events, et cetera. And and they range in costs and capabilities, but that's the future. So again, for those of you who are really adept at online fundraising, that might be something that you can share with other shelters about how you got there, because all of us are going to need to move there.
And I've activated that poll, and I see quite a few of you have voted already, but just I'll maybe give a second or two for other people to do that. And then I can share this now, share results. So 64% said yes, they do online fundraising, 36% said no.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the Women's Shelters Canada could do a buddy system.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the, and there's also going to be, as a side note, there's going to be online imperative around online service delivery to the extent that that is possible. That's absolutely the future. And there's lots of issues with that, of course, but that's the future for service delivery also, to the extent that you can. Okay, so the other piece I want to talk about that's specific to shelters is that I see there being an opportunity in terms of packaging up donor opportunities around capital improvements. So one of the things that has emerged is that shelters are not constructed for pandemics in terms of social distancing and what all those pieces look like. And so as that becomes clear, and as you guys do the work around what that looks like, I can see that to be an appetite from governments and other funders to, again, in terms of long-term resilience, to be able at the drop of a hat to go into that scenario again. And the fourth is to look at social enterprise and social enterprise is generating revenue that support the support your charity that is essentially run like a business. And the Canadian Women's Foundation has a grant stream that's coming out, I believe in September. It's the their third grant round around social enterprise, because it's something that the government is very interested in terms of how to look at other ways of generating funds. And capitalW has put in a couple of submissions to that, to their last two rounds, and have been successful in that. And we're very happy that one of those was for Women's Shelters Canada itself, and look forward to telling you more about that piece. But there are funds available, and if you have a social enterprise and are interested in getting a social enterprise, I'm also happy to have that conversation and look at what sourcing might be available, because again, wherever you can get unrestricted funding, specifically if it's also serving marginalized communities, you have a lot more pandemic resilience because your revenues are diversified. And those are the, yeah, so that's the broad kind of the pieces that I see. And I just wanted to go through the resources to show you what they are before I close off in terms of having a discussion. So the first is the COVID-19 responses, sorry, to say resources for fundraisers. So that's lists, it's a curated Imagine Canada piece on all kinds of resources, provincial, federal, the grant database that I mentioned, the report around online giving growth that Canada Helps did, which shows that online giving is growing at 3 times the pace of other forms of giving, and that was pre-COVID. And then there's a very helpful kind of cheat sheet at a glance, federal government initiatives for the charitable sector. As we know, a lot of the small business and other measures are in play for the sector, and there's also additional ones, and there will be more. And then to the sector response piece that I was talking about in terms of the initiatives, I put that link there for Imagine Canada, and then the link to information about the Red Door Shelters Community Dance-Off. And I want to end this piece of it and open it up for questions and discussion about, just to say that there's a lot of conversation about going back to the new normal. And I know that we are unanimous in understanding that the old normal was dreadful for so many women and their children, and that the new normal has to do better. And one of the things that COVID-19 is giving us is it's exhibiting the fault lines that have been there all along. And the vulnerabilities that somehow we've been able to compartmentalize or not understand, the vulnerabilities are in stark relief right now. And this is an opportunity to envision, to reimagine, as I say, to imagine Canada, to reimagine Canada. What could the world look like? Or how can we get to a world that looks like women being safe at home? And and speaking of the future, that's my 10-year-old daughter, which fills me with optimism. And she's pandemic resilient just by virtue of having gone through it. And I believe that this is an opportunity for us to pivot and to lead what the better normal can look like instead of a new normal. And I love this quote, that another world is not only possible, she is on her way, and on a quiet day I can hear her breathing. And I think we're a long way away from quiet days, but we do have solitude and the ability to listen intently. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathryn. So we do have quite a few questions lined up here, which is great. The first one, just to start off with, a few people wondering if you're willing to share the PowerPoint. Yeah, so I can email that to everyone who's on the webinar here today. I can email that around afterwards, so no worries on that front. So the first question, I think going back to the virtual event idea, wondering if that's something done on Zoom, like if people are buying tickets, or yeah, sort of the mechanics of that.
So there are, it could be done on Zoom. You would need to have an account. The free accounts end at 40 minutes, so you'd have to have an account, but there are, I believe, other platforms that could work. But Zoom is fine, absolutely. You just need to make sure what the if there's any maximums, and also the beautiful thing about it being virtual is that that you don't need to just limit it to your physical community. But you would need to, in terms of the delivery of food, know which communities people were living in.
Great. So another question is, so much of this is great, but for those of us who are not in large cities and might have limited access to corporations, not as many people in the community, high unemployment, which is now even higher, what are some thoughts you have to support those who might be in predominantly rural communities?
That's a great question. So again, it goes back to the same principles. So if I was sitting with you and looking at the specifics, I would look at the donors that you have and do, at minimum, do donor stewardship with them. Bring them in on what's happening on the inside. I would look at emergency response grants for rural communities. I know that the Minister for Wage is also the Minister of Rural Economic Development, and that they are I don't know if it's been suspended, but I know they were doing a call where they're very interested in twinning those two things together. And so there could be an opportunity to receive specific support by virtue of being in a rural area. And also, yeah, to take a look at the grants that are specific. So this is what is my experience, is that every single shelter, large or small, has its own private ecosystem, in the sense of its own, the people in the community that care. One of the upsides of a small community is that everybody can feel a sense of ownership of it, and that you are the only one in the community, which is an advantage in terms of having the audience, and in terms of being the single kind of focus for local pieces. And to look at companies that are thriving and make the case to them about the particular vulnerabilities of women in rural and remote communities and how COVID is affecting that. So I think that you have an opportunity, again, to steward donors and bring them into what that looks like. You have an opportunity to blog about what that's like. And I would work independently or with Women's Shelters Canada in terms of talking to Monsef's office about rural economic development and implications, because she is the minister of both. So it's a very handy, coincidence.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here, someone who says they're thinking about a virtual golf tournament. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Tell me more.
And if, go ahead.
What? Yeah, is that like everyone does mini putt in their house, or?
So I don't know, but if that person would like to share something else about that, other people might be interested in hearing, and Kathryn might be able to say more if we knew a little bit more about that. So if you want to share what you're thinking for the virtual golf tournament, feel free to put that in the box, the Q&A box or the chat box, and I can read that out as well. While someone is thinking about doing that.
I think this one thing though, what I would say is that any shelter who has an interesting concept right now will get traction from the media, right? Because there's so much interest. It's food bank, women's shelters, food bank shelters, food bank shelters, and so the opportunity is really the opportunity to generate money from virtual events right now is stronger for shelters and food banks than any other charities at this point. And that is the flip of what it usually is, where other charities that are much larger and have a lot more resources, often shelters can feel like they're kind of catching up, and they don't have the fundraising departments, and they don't have all of those things that the big shops do. But what you have now is attention, and this is an opportunity to capitalize on it in terms of fundraising, and bringing people into the story of what is happening in terms of bringing to life the experience of women who are afraid to leave. They have to stay home, and they are not safe there, and that is such a visceral experience. And to bring people into what that looks like, and also the piece about the upside that's expected to come after the social isolation has been lifted, so that the donors feel like that they can help you. And if there's particular specific things that you require, or that a certain amount of money can buy, or something, that's always helpful. Particularly if you can do it in a COVID frame. But this would be a very different webinar if it wasn't to women's shelters, because there are so few charities that are top of mind for anybody, particularly because everything is suspended and people have so much coming at them that it's hard to get any kind of mind share, but shelters have that mind share right now.
Great, thanks. And just an update, the person says they're still researching and thinking about what the virtual golf tournament can look like. No ideas as of yet. But to that person, feel free to let us know once you've thought of it, and we can always share that link on our Facebook or something like that if other shelters might be interested in learning from what that looks like. So another
thing I know for sure about golf is that it's such a bastion of men, predominantly, right? And in fact, the name golf, and this is absolutely true, stands for gentlemen only, ladies forbidden. And so I do love it being put to good purpose. And I think the audacity of it, because you think golf course, you think massive expansion of like huge space, to do that in a virtual way is very intriguing. And I found it very interesting in the United States that some of the first things to open were golf courses, which would suggest to me that it wasn't predominantly women making those choices. I had to guess. But the other thing I wanted to say is one of the biggest things that has emerged in terms of the charitable sector as a whole is looking at it with a gender lens, not even in terms of who's being effective and who's on the front line, but that the sector itself is up to 75% women, every charity. So it really is our sector. And so to kind of bring that to light in terms of everything that we're looking at, to really take seriously that we're in a contract with government to deliver services, and we're in a social contract with Canadians to be a safety net, and we don't need to beg for crumbs when we make the cake possible.
That's a great way of thinking about it. I love that. Another question that's come in, so we have a social enterprise thrift store, which we've had to close since mid-March, and that's a huge loss for our organization. Does anyone have any guidelines for reopening a thrift store safely, or curious to hear what others have done? Any thoughts on that?
So the thrift, my understanding is that thrift stores will have the same parameters that retailers do. So that the guidelines will be the same. The other piece of it is that there might be a reticence to buy used clothing by virtue of COVID staying on surfaces, and just, you know, that might be one of the things that shifts. And so there might need to be that all the items are dry cleaned or some other parameter, which makes, unfortunately, the thrift store much more expensive. But just to be mindful of those pieces. And again, to look at the viability of online thrift stores, like taking it online in some capacity.
Great. Thank you. And so one last question that's in here. So I would encourage anyone else who does still have a question to pop that in there now while we're going through this one. And so this person says, with so many businesses struggling, laying off employees, etc., it's a challenging time to be making sponsorship or donation asks. Are there other ways our organizations can be engaging our corporate supporters at this time?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One is that there absolutely has to be a sensitivity to the economic realities, but I wouldn't so quickly go to they can't help us financially, because in any context there are businesses that are thriving. The manufacturers of masks are doing really well, for example. And there are entrepreneurs and other enterprises that do want to help, and there are large groups like TD, for example, that has a whole 25 million COVID-19 response piece. So it depends, but I wouldn't go there. You need to be sensitive, and that's where the relationship building comes from. That's where you're talking to people that you know well, you know what their situation is, and that you are offering support and recognition, particularly if you can get media, then it's helpful. And if any current donors that you have are going to be interested in how they can be part of a COVID response. So if you ask a current donor who has capacity, and again, that comes from the relationship, knowing if they have capacity, but that they, like it could be like a local TELUS, for example, or something like that, that they are able to be part of the first shelter in place event. That's going to see the delivery of local restaurant, like local meals to participants. And I think that it could, to change the frame a little bit from, this is a unique opportunity as one of the charities that is has the highest profile right now, that we can give that profile to some of our current partners by offering them the opportunity to be part of a virtual event. And they can always say no, but don't presume something that's not in your favor to begin with. Imagine that it could be possible, or it might be that they can't, their employees could, or so. Okay, so all of that aside, the second is that it's a way of stewarding current corporate or organization or unions or anyone that you work with, to give them an opportunity to be part of, planning the event, picking the restaurants, or on the case of the virtual golf, delivering all of the mini putt to homes, or like to engage them in that way, and to look carefully at the people that volunteer for you and your donors about what it is that they do in their day jobs, because this would be a great time if you have people that that are entrepreneurs or work in finance, that have the bandwidth to help think through long-term financial resilience for the organization, or to use what they do in their day jobs to support the work of the shelters. So, and again, specific to what your shelter might need in terms of in-kind goods, I don't know what those could be, or helping you to source things that you require, that anything that you can frame up, that you can find somebody that can help with.
Great, thank you. And we do have 2 more questions, so maybe we can get through those quickly before we are out of time here. Before I go to those, I just want to say quickly, just to plug our thing here, but the Facebook group, the link that I shared for that in the chat at the beginning, I would encourage people to join that Facebook group, because we do sometimes, companies or someone will reach out with kind of an in-kind offer or something like that, if they have extra inventory or something. And so sometimes we will share that kind of thing in the Facebook group or other means. So those links I shared up at the top of the chat box, I would just encourage you to check those out if you're listening in and wondering about that. So a question, do you have a template of a letter that could be used to send to our connections? We wanted to revise our current letter, but question how to connect during this difficult time for all, including donors.
So I'm happy to do a templated letter. I imagine that there are many shelters who have done that and done it beautifully, and they might be willing to share. But I'm absolutely happy to do something templated. But what I would say is that template is the opposite of what you want to do at this point, in terms of it's very high touch, phone call, depending on, of course, how many donors you have. But it's a high touch moment, and it's a thank you for being on this journey. We never could have imagined And knowing that you're with us makes all the difference. And we just wanted to thank you for that. And that everyone can do, even if there's no more money on the table, that will pay off substantively going forward. And the upside is that it's also true and it's authentic. And what you are doing is so remarkable. And it's an honor for people to be part of it, and they want to be part of it.
Great. So last question here then in our last few minutes. Once you receive a substantial donation early on for COVID-19, what are your thoughts about going back to that donor maybe 4, 5, 6 months down the road for another donation?
Absolutely. And what is really, there's a science to major gifts in terms of the cadence of when you ask and how you ask. And it's always more often than you would imagine, because sometimes it's, oh, I don't want to bother them again. But it's also very much about the relationship and understanding who they are and what their capacity is. And if they're open to making a multi-year pledge. It could be that you've received a substantive gift, and then it's, we are recognizing that this is we want to be pandemic resilient, and could you, would you consider making this pledge for the next 3 years for us as we bridge to what's next? Or could you imagine having a virtual event where you introduce us to people in your network who might want to also be part of this COVID journey with us. And every type of fundraising is different. It has a different cadence, a different response time. And that could be something also that's of interest just around major gifts in particular. And I also see for shelters the really important work around legacy giving. Because it's something that's difficult to do well, but it pays off. And I think that the COVID-19 has end of life very much on people's minds and the kinds of legacy that they want to leave. And so that's also something to look at and consider. And given that many shelters don't have on staff fundraisers, and even the ones that do, that there's lots of resources about how to do legacy giving and each type of fundraising, because direct response versus annual giving, major giving, legacy giving, social enterprise, it's all different, and they can all interconnect.
Great. Thank you, Kathryn. And so those are all the questions, and we are just sort of at the end of our time here. Did you want to say any sort of last thoughts or anything before we wrap up?
I wanted to thank you all for what you're doing. I am in awe and deeply appreciative of it. And if I can help in any way, I hope this has been somewhat helpful, and do stay in touch.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kathryn. That was super informative and I think much appreciated, and there's lots of great ideas there. And so that people know, so I will email around the PowerPoint and any other resources that have kind of come up in this. And Kathryn's email is on the screen there as well, or her information. And yes, always feel free as well to reach out to us if you have, suggestions for templates or resources that could be useful, and we're always happy to sort of look at how we can help share those as well. So thank you so much, Kathryn, and thank you to everyone who's participated and asked all your questions today. And thanks, of course, to our interpreter who has been making sure this is accessible to everyone.
And thank you to Women's Shelters Canada for existing and convening the space for the webinar.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.